everybody, or good afternoon, some sort of time. Anyway, so I was supposed to create this easy peasy lemon squeezy gradebook, and it's just stuff that I use when I'm trying to keep track of a course, and I thought it might be helpful for other people to see. I freely admit I've stolen ideas from Melanie Yasko and also Rachel Winkenwerder and probably about 67 other people who I forget. But anyway, I first logged onto Pirate Portal and clicked on Faculty Resources and went to Attendance Sheets and stole one of Helen Dvorak's wonderful attendance sheets. And once I did that, I suddenly had Excel functioning. And once Excel was functioning, then I was able to have it look like this. For creating this gradebook, I created some extra tabs. I was going to create this from hand, which I did, but I was going to recreate this by hand on video, which I was going to do. But then I realized that I had no time, because if you take a peek at the bottom there, you will see just how, not this one, you will see just how late in my day this is. And it's almost time. So we're pretty much out of time. So I'm just going to talk you through the gradebook we've got. So here's what I have. There's the attendance sheet. If you have Excel open, you've got the attendance sheet. Normally there's a set of instructions there, and I properly named it Pretend and then got rid of that. But what you really are interested in is adding some new sheets. So I just went ahead and clicked on New Sheet, and I did things like type in Overview. And then you can add another new sheet. That name was already taken in this case, that's fair. So pretend like I'm typing Overview, but I'm going to secretly type Overview 1. And then another sheet. Again, double click on it, or you can also right click and hit rename. Either one of these works. And then I named something Grade View. And I'll name that Grade View 1. You get the idea. I created all these tabs here on the left. One tab for each of the different assignments I was going to give. And then I wanted a grade view for the whole thing. And then I also wanted some sort of action overview. Once I had these, notice these tabs when you create them are very bland and boring, and so I right-click and select some tab colors and do that. Now those of you who know me know that I am colorblind, so it seems kind of silly to do some kind of different colors, but I did it all the same because I can see these colors, I think, as long as they're blue. If they're purple, that's not my fault. I can't see red. Anyway, once you've got tabs, if you make a tab you don't want, that's okay. You can click Delete. Once you've got tabs, here's what you can have. The first thing that I like when I have students is I like to have a complete overview. I like that complete overview because I find it pretty helpful to be looking at, sorry, I keep on getting distracted. I find it really helpful to be able to see a few things. I like to see my students' names. Sometimes I even create a third column here, which is a name that they like to be called. Some people go by nicknames or whatnot, and I do like to be able to remember all of my students. V-number is helpful for a lot of things, and then I have a few columns here. So let's take a look at this. I do tend to care about weighted mean. Obviously I teach way too much statistics, but the idea is, let's say a student only does one assignment, but they get an A on it. And it's one assignment that they've only done because it's the first day or second day of the semester. Well, the idea is, just because you've done one assignment, if we're working on a complete point scale grade book based on a syllabus, you wouldn't really want to just say, oh, you only have 10 points, and right now you're failing the class because you need 800 points out of 13,000 or 1,300 to be able to pass. So the idea of weighted mean is to just say, it's keeping track of how many points have occurred so far and how many points you've earned. So it's sort of earned value divided by total possible current value, as opposed to total possible in the whole course. Notice I also have a running letter grade then based on it. That's just based on my grade scale, and I'll show you that in a second. I'm going to have an attendance rate here. I'm going to show you how I built that. I haven't fully built this, as you can see, again, because I am running out of time. I also care about student learning outcomes. These are the things that for those of us in maybe the 4-credit side of things have from the Higher Education Coordinating Boards, ACGM. But we care about student learning outcomes, and I've actually built some assignments that specifically measured a single learning outcome And I did that so that later on here under assessment, I could tie yes or no based on my academic master syllabi to one particular assignment that just measured one thing for me. Now, if I was more clever with Excel, I could probably set it up so that I could just grab some questions off of an assignment that I graded by hand, but I tend to do a lot of my work through computer-graded things, so it was just easier for me to create a single assignment for each of the learning outcomes. And I've given these generic names. In my real-life personal grade books, I admit I tend to call them by more interesting titles that help me. Then we also care about program-level outcomes. Those are important. Again, I was going to stick them here under assessment, and I was just going to create some more columns here somewhere, and again, just have this overview here. The idea being, I could look at the class at any time and say, am I achieving the learning outcomes for the student? Have we done the program level outcomes or the core competencies? One last column, because it's hard for me to keep track in my head with a bunch of students whether I'm supposed to be dropping a student. So I created this little column here that would let me know if it's time to drop. Remember, VC does have a required attendance policy, and so if you have a student who is both failing and has 20% or more absences, then you're allowed to drop them, and once it hits 40% or more absences out of the total course, suddenly it becomes a requirement that we drop them, provided it's before last drop day. Then over here I created my grading scale. I built this up pretty simply on a straight 70, 80, 90 scale, and so that's how this works. So now that I've sort of talked to you about the overview, let's chat about the grade book here a little bit, the grade view. Again, it's the same list of names, and here's actually where the weighted mean is calculated. And notice this terribly complicated formula that's up here. So let's talk about this for just a little bit. I built my class not based on points, but based on weighted percents. If you built yours on points, that's entirely doable as well. In fact, if you come to my talk on, I think, Tuesday, and I don't remember what time, but I will as soon as my phone texts me some information, I can talk about creating points, and I think also Melanie and Rachel will be there with me helping everyone wandering around, because we're in a computer lab, which is pretty cool. But anyway, I graded this grade book that I was thinking of, based on my stats course, face-to-face, on weights. And so I said I want homework to be worth 15%, I want the class clicker to be 15, quizzes are 20, exams are 20, and a final exam I was going to make be 30% of the grade. And this added up. Notice here on this grade weights thing, I've created a grade weights statement on top. I did that entirely by just typing in grade weights. And then I did want to make it fancy, so I went ahead and hit merge and center. And then I could type in things like homework and clicker and quizzes and exams and final exam. And then over here on the right, I picked percents, and I totally just typed in 15% and 15%, and I picked these with reasons at one point. I admit I didn't conduct a thorough literature review. I pretty much just picked a set of percents that seemed to nicely incorporate all the different parts. I also did the rather highly weighted clicker here more recently because I was trying to encourage more classroom attendance. Anyway, then I also had, I guess, a total column here. And this I used just this auto sum feature in Excel, and we'll use this on a couple more places, and it just adds all those up. In fact, generally, when I'm trying to pick class weights and percents, I like to do the auto sum first so that I can be keeping track and make sure I don't do something silly like get excited and say I want 35% on the final exam and realize that, you know, can't do 100%, under 5%. Anyway, once I got that, then I recopied those same names, homework, clicker, quizzes, exams, final exam here. And now here's where the magic starts to happen, because if you go down here to this cell D2, you're going to see, and by the way, you can go to my website, mattwiley.org, and click on Talks and Presentations, and you can download this very Excel file so that you can be sort of following along maybe as I'm talking over this video and play around with it. So notice here where this links to. This says equals homework exclamation point C2. And what that tells you is that this cell doesn't actually do any numbers in here. Instead, it wants you to look at the homework tab, that's the equal homework, and it wants you to look at the spot C2, which is this one right here. And notice what cell C2 does. Cell C2 says for the student Gandalf Graham, what it wants you to do is it wants you to add up all these homework scores, and then it wants you to do some pretty interesting magic. So let's talk about this. This first command, and I do have an extra set of parentheses in here. I think that that's kind of useful, so let's just show how those parentheses are working. Notice when Excel, when you kind of pass your cursor, I'm using the left and right arrow keys. Notice how the very first parens and the very last parens before the slash are kind of highlighting in bold. You might need to make YouTube go pretty large to see it, but I think I am managing to record this in high def. So that just gets the top of my fraction, then I have this division symbol, and then I have my denominator part of my fraction together. And notice what my commands are. My first command is sum. We've already seen the sum command, and it sums from D2 all the way to W2. That's what's adding up that first row. And the command is just D2 colon W2, and it will add that up. You don't even have to remember that syntax. Check it out. If we were to make a new student, oh, badgers. That was exactly what I wanted to not do. So, new student. Suppose I wanted to do this. Let's just get some numbers in here, equals random. That'll give us some scores between 0 and 1. Notice here too how I chose to do these scores. You could do points. If you did points, let's say you wanted to do like 14 points out of a total of 15 points, you could just type in equals 14 divided by 15 and this would give numbers. I just typed in raw numbers as if I'd already calculated out the weights. But anyway, we could type in equals and parens, and then we could type in sum and a parens again. And now if I want to get all these numbers to be added up in the sum, I'm just clicking my mouse button, the left mouse button, and highlighting down this row. And see here, it's gone ahead and done D12 through W12. I think D12 is the name of a band. So that would go ahead and sum up all those pieces. But I want to do more than just sum up all those pieces. If we go up to here, we see that a little more magic's happening. We've also subtracted 2 sets of numbers. In my syllabus, I promised to drop the lowest 2 homework scores. That's because over the years I realized that I was very bad at deciding whether students needed a makeup or not, and I couldn't figure out if, some students have sent me very strange emails, and, any true emergency, because I used to see my professors would say things like, well, if it's an emergency, get in touch with me before the assignment's due, and then I'll excuse it maybe, or let you make it up. But real emergencies don't come with the ability, usually, to let somebody know in advance. So I just promise all my students, look, I'll drop the lowest 2 assignments. And you can use that however you want. Some students show up to every day of class, they turn in every assignment, and this drops the lowest 2. In fact, notice Mr. Gandalf here has a perfect 0.8 on every single one of his assignments. So you drop the lowest 2, which is 2 of the 0.8s, and it doesn't really do much for him, but I offer him the service nonetheless. Rather than drop random ones, I tell which ones I want dropped. So the way you do that is with the small command, because it's going to find the smallest number in the row. So again, it goes ahead and it gets that row from D2 to W2, and then I say comma 1. Comma 1 telling you I want the smallest. And then, since I want to drop the lowest 2, I also talk to it about small, comma 2, because I'm dropping the second smallest. It counts from the bottom. So notice what I've done. I've added up all the numbers, then we subtract the smallest, and we subtract the second smallest. Now we want to divide, because I don't want, as you can see here at the bottom, if I just did sum, and even if I did sum and subtracted these 2 small ones, and notice again, Excel's kind. It tells you it wants an array of numbers, so that's that first list there. And it tells you it wants another number, k, to tell you which position it wants. So if I go ahead and subtract those 2 smallest numbers from this new student here that I'm creating, that's nice. but it doesn't really give me a number that I want still, because I'd like a percent, the homework average, and this is just added up all the homeworks. And you know how to take average. You take all the numbers and you divide it by 2. But remember, we've subtracted the smallest 2. Furthermore, what if I didn't have quite so many? What if we were much earlier on in the semester and I only had 2 assignments? It would be silly to divide this guy by 20. Well, maybe I want one more than 2, right? I don't know. Let's make some number up there. Notice it subtracted this one, and this one is 2 of the smallest, and it has only recorded, if we only have 3, these 2. So what we want is we want a command where we're dividing, and we want to divide by however many we've got, plus we want to subtract 2. So the way you do that in Excel is you say count. Count just counts, much like the count on Sesame Street. It just goes ahead and counts. It counts anything that's got something in it. So maybe I could do this same count command here just so you can see how it works all by itself. If I count this same row up here that just has 3 things in it, count's going to tell me 3, because it's going to say 1, 2, 3, and it's going to ignore all these blanks down the rest of the way. And that's pretty nice. But I don't want to count 3, really. I don't want to divide by 3, because remember, we're subtracting the smallest 2. So we just hard code that in there by saying -2. And that's why I do that parentheses on the denominator as well, just to make sure it all works out nicely. So notice, when you just have 3 assignments for the student, it drops the lowest one, it drops the second lowest one, it keeps the only one left, and it divides by 3 minus 2, which is dividing by 1, so your score is that third highest assignment. Or third smallest, first highest. As I start to type in more scores for this student down here, let's say from here on out this student's done some strange things at the beginning. They did really well, they did really well, they did not so well, and then it starts stabilizing. Don't worry that these 2 numbers are changing, I just used random, so let's lock these at 0.9 and 0.9, and then they did really bad at 0.123. Let's say they even got a 0 on that third one, okay? And then they managed to stabilize at 70% for the whole rest of the term. Notice that as I keep on typing in, that's a strange number, let's actually make it 0.9. As we keep on typing in 0.7s, that this score keeps on doing its thing and updating. And since 70% is lower than those early 90s, the student's score kind of slowly diminishes on average over the whole term. Then you sit them down for some intrusive advising near the end of semester, and they respond well to that. And so then their numbers go up again, and they do pretty well. So that's how I just add up the homework assignments. Again, the nice thing about that is this homework average right here is what we call a running total. It's telling you how the student's doing on average with the smallest ones dropped. Now, I admit I really like getting good evals for my students, so I never tend to talk to them too loudly about what their score is. Here, with dropping the lowest 2 till closer to the end of term, they find that maybe, if students are like, oh, I can drop the lowest 2, what you tend to get is, I don't know, students, well, you guys know how to teach, so why am I telling you this? I'm just trying to talk to you about a grade book. Anyway, use clever marketing. Your life will be better. So here we go. Now, another nice thing about Excel, let me go ahead and delete these. Once you've gone to all the trouble to type out this command at the beginning, let's say you wanted to drop the lowest 3 because you do like 30 assignments. Well, you could still go into here and you would just add one more command of minus small d2 to w2, comma 3. Maybe you need to extend it beyond W2 because you're doing 30, so you'll be out here into the double digits. And then you do the count minus 3, so you just change some of those numbers and add some things. But the point is, once you've figured it out for one student, in Excel you can hover your mouse over that little square in the corner here and watch how my little plus sign shape that's empty in the middle has managed to get a little solid look when I get to that bottom right corner. When I've got that and dragged down, this is called the fill handle in Excel, And pretty much like magic, Excel is clever enough to realize that, well, here we're on row 2, here we're on row 3, 4, 5, 6. Notice it doesn't affect the 1 and the 2, so that's all working out just fine with the correct number of subtractions. But now these things are looking in the proper rows so that we can actually see that Azog the Defiler is not so good at his grades. In fact, towards the end there, it falls off pretty badly. And it wasn't so great to start with. I suppose that's what happens when you're trying to kill people. Anyway, so this is how this works. Something else I do here. Notice these family name and given name, your first and last name? I'm grabbing these from the overview column. So from that very first overview piece, I only type in my roster once. In fact, I tend to copy it actually out of a Blackboard download. I only put this in here once, and once I've got these numbers here on this very first tab, every single one of our tabs here simply is just looking in the overview. So if I manage to have misspelled a name, I only have to fix it in one place, and it will get fixed everywhere for me. So the grade view just goes ahead and grabs that homework score straight from the homework sheet. It does the same thing for the clicker sheet. Again, I created a sheet for the clicker. The clickers were just a little bit more complicated, because I do it with points. Here I put number of days in the course. That's going to be important for my number of missed days, because I am interested in deciding if I can, well, look at the overview. We're interested in talking about drops, and it's going to make some decisions about whether somebody is allowed to be dropped or not. So, let's go ahead and see when people are allowed to be dropped. Let's take a look at this clicker. In classes that I have face-to-face where I have clickers, I like to not have to fill out attendance by hand and take clicker. So instead, I simply ask clicker questions, and I give students some points, no matter what they answer on the clicker, to encourage attendance and to encourage them to show up and to engage. I think I read from the Turning Point people's website that their advice was for questions that meant something in the course. So in a statistics class, if I ask people, what does it mean when I say the word mean in statistics, and I give them some options, one of which might be arithmetic average as a possibility. That question, if they select arithmetic average, well then they're going to get 5 points. But if they select something crazy on my list, they'll still get 2. So I tend to reward my students rather well for clicking something because I find it encourages attendance and participation. I don't recommend giving away the bank, but do something there. So once I've got this, then we go to the attendance sheet, and here's where some of the magic happens. Because what I like to do is I like to write this command in here. And notice that the way I would build this at first, and I hadn't gone ahead and spread this out over the entire term, but I would. I only did that because I was trying to keep this clicker area small enough. Obviously, we have more than 5 lectures. Now this screen's big, but my laptop's not, and I thought I was going to record it on my laptop first, so I was just making this small enough to look manageable. And we can definitely insert more columns in a second, particularly when you're building yours. So here under attendance, what we did is we went into here and we did an if statement. And take a look at how we compose the if statement. I really love if statements in Excel because they let me build a gradebook that's quite powerful and is actually rather smart enough to do things on its own, so that with my ADD and massive lack of attention to detail, I don't mess up grades, which are really important to my students. So I like this if statement, and here's how the if statement's built. It has what they call a logical test, and then if that logical test is true, it spits out one answer. If that logical test is false, it spits out another answer. And with my gradebook, I like to track absences rather than presence. So I have these A's show up as people aren't there. So they start off the term, and again, this is why I don't show this to students right away because it's terribly demoralizing, with a whole row of absences, and I have the first week or two usually that I have to do by hand because they don't have the clickers yet, right? So here's how this works. What I ask this if statement to do is I ask it to go back to the clicker page, Again, that's this tab down here at the bottom called Clicker. I ask it to look at cell C2 for Mr. Gandalf Graham, and I ask if it equals 0. So I say if the clicker cell C2 equals 0, and so if there's a 0 recorded in that clicker column, or nothing, it will spit out an A for absent. The only way a student can earn a 0 on a class day with clickers, remember, because I give points even for wrong answers as long as you click, is by not being there. So if a student isn't there, they'll have a 0, and in which case that will spit out an A. Otherwise, it will spit out nothing at all. That's what those parens, and I haven't typed anything in here, are. So let's take a look how that works. Go back over here to clickers. Let's say that in the very first lecture, our students do something. And I've claimed that the points possible are 10. So let's say a couple students, Gandalf seems to be overall a pretty good sort, so he's gotten 10s. Saruman's smart, if not good, and Smaug also seemed to pull off some things. And then one student got 5 points right, Thorin got one question right, but he just clicked on another, so he's got, what, 5, 7? Bilbo's kind of the same. Bilbo's more clever, but we only asked 2 clicker questions that day. Notice how this is working. We've got some 7s. Grima showed up, so he's got like 4. Well, no, let's make this guy, he's an elf, he probably should have more than 4. Grima only showed up to 1 question. He showed up halfway to class, and he just clicked something randomly as he kind of walked past the hallway. So that was a 2, and Azog never even went to class, because that's what he doesn't do. Notice, the clicker one's kind of clever. It's gone ahead, and it's been looking at the sums, so it's trying to sum up all the clicker points that students get. Notice down here for total, it's also summing up the total points possible so far. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, with clickers, I never know what I'm going to do until pretty much seconds before class when I put the questions in there. So I'm able to make the clickers be a running total just by having this last column be total possible and having the score be the points that student made divided by the current total possible points. And so the next class day, I want to ask 3 questions, so we've got 15. And then I can record all the different point possibilities that could be there. I don't know. And so you can see how the scores work with something like that. Notice, as long as you've got something, as long as you've got some points here, this doesn't count as a missed day. Here's another command that I love in Excel. It's very similar to the if command, and it's very similar to the count. I've gone ahead and pre-selected every lecture, but I've said count if. And I'm going to count if, and the count if command works like so. It tells it a range, so you tell it where to look, and then I tell it what you're looking for. And this missed days is looking for 0s. I like to use this count if because notice these blanks right here. It's not counting them because those are blanks. But this 0 right here, because he's actually missed a day, this does count as 1. So this student has missed 1 day of class. For calculating the score, we use another command in Excel that I tend to like. Let me show you how it works. You want to take the sum of points that the student has, and you'd love to divide by the number of total possible, and that's great. But remember how we wanted to use that fill handle to just go ahead and drag down here and fill in everything? I want to tell the fill handle that this cell H12, this one down here, isn't going to change. The way you do that in Excel is using these $signs. That locks that particular cell, H12, in place and says everyone else should change because they're in different rows, but I always want you to look in H12. So then once you've got that, you can drag that in there, and it will populate that with scores. Of course, those scores on the grade view, when I'm curious about clicker score, it goes to the clicker column. It looks at section I2. If we go to clicker, sure enough, there at I2, there's where each of those clicker scores are. Furthermore, notice how these people attended. Let's go back to attendance. Like magic, all the people who did show up, they've lost their absences for that day, but Azog, who did not show up, his absence is right there. So as we fill in more days of clicker points, as those happen, You can be very clever with this, with Turning Point updating to Blackboard and then just downloading and copying and pasting some things from Blackboard into each column. And it takes a second to be able to get a full set of attendance. I don't know, some of these people just answered some questions, they got it right. Azog finally showed up to class, so he doesn't get another 0, but it's going rough for him. Notice on the attendance there, then you have a whole column of people who've successfully shown up that day to class. So this makes the attendance really easy to record the whole thing for the whole semester, and I find it's kind of helpful. Then of course quizzes. Again, for quizzes, I just dropped the lowest quiz because I normally only have in a regular 16-week term 1 quiz a week. So my idea was by dropping 2 of the homeworks and 1 of the quizzes, that's about a week's worth. And I don't like to encourage students to not show up for a week, but if something terrible happens, you could imagine that they might be gone for an entire week. And with 16 weeks out there, I don't really feel like I'm losing vast insight into how their performance is by forgiving 1 week. That way I don't have to sit them down and somehow quiz them. Same command as we'd use with the homework, only this time since I'm only dropping 1, I was lazy. I did the minimum command because it only looks for the absolute smallest, and of course instead of subtracting 2, I just subtracted 1. So that gave these all out. Now when I'm doing my assessment, and I said that I write some specific assignments, I tend to do that on quizzes. I like that because quizzes are timed, at least in my world, and I either do them in class or if I do them online, I use a lockdown browser and I make them timed. So the idea in my head was that this probably represents really well what that student knows, and I didn't want to overinflate my learning outcome objective performance. So what I did for assessment then, well, I take this final quiz score and use it in the grade view thing. Again, it just goes to quizzes and looks at that. For assessment, I created another command. And again, you see my favorite if command there. And I said if a particular quiz, in this case I use cell F2, I think that represents the 4th quiz, if that is greater than 0.7, so if they scored higher than a 70 on that quiz, and that's what we've defined in our academic master syllabi as success for that learning outcome, if they've scored a 70%, then I want it to say yes here. Otherwise I want it to say no. So Gandalf on his 4th quiz did in fact score 70 or higher. Actually, I think my statement in my academic master syllabi was greater than or equal to 70, so I probably have to type in a greater than or equal here. Watch as Excel screams at me, but no, we're okay. So that's probably what I should have done, because otherwise Gandalf could have scored exactly a 70, and then I would have been lying. Somehow Azog has managed to do well there, and I have no idea how that happened, but good for him. Anyway, so these students have achieved that learning outcome. These ones haven't. If we go back and take a look at the 4th quiz, you can see that some of these are kind of long numbers because I just used random generators to fill it up with some garbage text just to show how it worked. But you can see that Sir Thorn Oakenshield only scored a 47% on that assignment. So I said he had not mastered learning outcome 1, which I think in the statistics course has something to do with understanding that statistics is a math discipline that talks about the real world. Anyway, so we've got these. Then I made another one of these count ifs, which I think is probably my second favorite thing, because I asked it to just look through this row and I asked it to count all the yeses. So by the end of the term, I have this running total of how many yeses we've got. And I know we're expecting 6 of them in total, because I had 6 learning outcomes here. And for this score, I didn't do anything crazy like a running total. I admit I didn't really care. All I wanted was to be seen as we progress, how am I doing on these learning outcomes overall? Notice this doesn't make part of my grade. I think that assessment isn't really exactly directly tied to grades, though obviously grades in it are somehow related. But it does show up here on my overview, and I liked this, and I designed it not weighted specifically because I thought, well, the learning outcome sort of shows me how we're progressing through the class. So the idea being, if I'm about halfway through the class, I would like to see maybe, 50% here mostly. Students under that would get me worried. Whereas if we're near the end, I'm hoping to see several 100%. It also gives me a nice heads up because at the end of the term, when I'm getting ready to actually commit to letter grades, if someone has a passing letter grade, I would really like to see them having an overall pretty well a good mastery of the learning outcomes. That tells me I've written my tests and quizzes well, because I've written things that were related to the outcomes, and I haven't been going off and asking crazy stuff. Conversely, students who aren't doing so well, maybe I would be expecting to see learning outcomes not so much there. Again, that's at the end of the course. If you want to weight those, go right ahead. It's not too hard to do, and in fact, if you come to my session, I'm sure Melanie or Rachel and I would be thrilled to help you do that if you've got questions. Again, on assessments, I'm going to eventually make this a little fancier. I just cleaned this up. I would like to also be tracking the program learning outcomes and the core competencies as well with specific assignments. This is a work in progress grade book based on the ones that Melanie, Rachel, and I have used so far, and then made it just a little bit fancier so that you don't think we're all crazy. Or maybe this does make you think we're crazy. I also, over here on this overview, wanted to see some big things about my class. So I did take the average of the weighted means. I called this mean, and this let me see what the class average was. And since I do teach stats, and this was supposed to be a stats class, I also cared about the standard deviation, and what's the usual plus or minus. This class is being pretty wild in the sense that, plus or minus 20% there for standard deviation. That's a pretty big, that's plus or minus 2 letter grades. That's maybe kind of a wide swing to get most of the students. I was going to do a trimmed mean and a trimmed standard deviation where I cut off maybe. Particularly, I think this would be important if you had a student who was on your books. They showed up there to the first 12 class days and then disappeared, and no matter what you did, you couldn't reach them ever afterwards. I don't know that I would want that 0 affecting me. So while I might keep track of it here, because hopefully it wouldn't drop next time, I might be able to have a better sense of what my teaching was, because obviously it doesn't matter how I teach if a student's never there. So it seemed like a trimmed mean perhaps was a bit better thing to have here, and I had the option to just put a space for it. I hadn't done the command for it yet. Alright, so we've got attendance, and here in attendance there's one other thing, because remember, if you have a low enough average, then you have to talk about the date last attended. So I just wanted this to pop up averages, because it says only for students who drop or receive an F. So once again, you'll see our very popular if command. I go to the overview, I go to the grade part of the overview and say if it's an F, then I want you to go again to the overview and tell me the percent they've got so far. Otherwise, put nothing. So you'll see that all the students who don't have Fs have nothing, but all the rest do in fact have their average that's recorded right there. So that's another nice thing. But let's talk about that F as we're getting here, and my goodness, I've been talking for almost 40 minutes now. That's sad. But anyway, let's talk here, and let's take a look at this running grade right here. And this is a useful command. I admit it's not maybe the most frequent one I use. I use it about once a semester per class. But it's still nice all the same. What we've done is we've created a VLOOKUP table. Again, just like when we had created some other things, I created this letter grade header. On the left here, I wrote the percent 0, 60, 70, 80, and 90. And it's important that they go in increasing order, and that you put the percents in as you're expecting your comparison numbers to look. Then to the right of each percent, I put a letter grade. And notice here what we've got. I don't have the upper score, I've got the lower score. So 0% is the lowest score someone could get, and that's the starting place for an F. Once someone's up to a 60%, that gives them a D. Once someone's up to a 70, they're in C territory, 80, they're to a B territory, and so on. Then what we do here is we just do a little bit of magic. We type in equals VLOOKUP, and the first thing you select is the number you want to compare. So in this case, I select Gandalf's grade. The next thing you select here is I select the entire table, not the header, just the table, again by holding my left mouse button down, clicking and dragging so that I select 0 all the way to that A. Notice Excel's going to be kind enough to just spit in some numbers there. And then the next thing I select is 2. I put 2 here to tell you that the thing I want you to give me back is this second column, not the first column. I want the letters, so I hit 2. Let's go ahead and type in a random score for a pretend student here, point, I don't know, 52, well, I don't know, 52% here. And let's type in VLOOKUP. Excel tries to complete this for me, so I'll go ahead and do that. I pick the lookup value. We highlight the table array, comma, and then I say the range lookup number, and again I'm picking 2, and then I'll close the parens. Notice when I did this, it did not have the $sign, so I would put $signs around everything to lock that table in place so that we could drag and drop and use the fill handle. Now let's take a look. What if we have someone who has a 61%? Well, now that should be a D. What if we've got somebody who has a 92%? Well, that should be an A. So as students, as you just have to enter grades in for each of the individual homework, clicker, quizzes, and exam scores, the student has this running letter grade. And since we built this in the grade view to be a weighted mean, so that it can calculate how things are working well throughout, this letter grade is sort of that student's current letter grade in the course, which is rather nice. The very last thing here on this overview is this decision to drop. The decision to drop says this. I say if, again a very common word, and now for drop I do the word and. Now and is important. Remember, if compares something and looks at some piece of logic. So and asks me to compare two things, because that's the requirement to drop, right? You need to be missing class and you need to be failing it. You don't want to punish a student who's doing really well in the class, and just because a student's doing not so well, if they're showing up, that's not enough cause to drop them. So the first thing I say is I want to look and see is if this position F5 right here, which is this attendance rate column, if that is going to be less than 80%. Now that 80% is important because remember, as long as they have to miss 20% of the class, right, to be able to be eligible to drop. So we have to calculate that out. And the second thing is that this E column has to be an F, so it has to equal F. If both of these are met, that's why we do the and. It has to be, you have less than 80% attendance overall, and you've got yourself an F. Then it's going to say drop. And this, of course, doesn't automatically drop them. We have to go do that by filling out a form and sending off to counselor help. But as long as it's there, then I sort of know, oh, okay, this is a problem person. I put the command at 80%. Probably in my real life, this really shouldn't be called mandatory drop yet, right? It should be called optional drop. I would probably have 2 columns in my class, now that I've gone ahead and built this. And that way, one would say start to drop, and the next column would say, now you really need to drop them. And of course, I would try to intervene with students if this flag came up. Now, I like to think that I would notice if a student was not showing up to class without this, but I think that maybe having this pop up gives me kind of a heads up if I'm maybe not seeing all my students here. I tend to have one big grade book with using tabs where actually this overview is not just for one class, but I have these tabs for all my classes, and so this overview is showing me for my entire student population for that term. And that's kind of nice because that way I can instantly spot students who are having difficulties, and hopefully I can engage in some sort of intervention. And this lets me keep track of that because, I don't know, I think, 5 classes, 20, 30 students a class, we can have quite a few students that a faculty member is trying to keep track of. So I find this helps me. One last thing I like to do is I do like to have this little head count thing. So let me chat with you about that, and then maybe one more other thing. This attendance rate, all I would do is I would go to this attendance piece here and be counting, well, missed class days and days in course, I suppose, would give me a sense of attendance rate, so I wouldn't even have to go there. We just do a division. All right, last thing, and then I promise this video will stop. And obviously I'm not going to make you listen to this. I have this count, and again, using that same command, count if, I ask it to count through all the letter grades, and I ask it to count just the ones 03, and that's to be the ones that are Fs. Then I did drag the fill handle, and so this was counting Fs, Ds, Cs, Bs, and As, and I also asked it to count Ws. W's are the only ones that would not be automatic. Instead, let's suppose that Grandma Wormtongue decided to drop. I would just personally go in and type a W here because now I no longer need a running letter grade for Mr. Wormtongue. And so he's W'd. Now I no longer need to be thinking about dropping him because he's been dropped. And notice now this W command has shown up. And there it is. Notice this chart down here for head counts. Watch what happens when I type the W in. Notice right now there are no drops from the course. I type in the W and hit enter, and boom, it changes. That's also pretty cool. This head count graph is interactive. It's real, live, and real time, and it shows you right now, if the course stopped today, because that's the beauty of the weighted mean, here's what it would look like. So if this course stopped today, it looks pretty ghastly because we've got a lot of Fs. But I suppose that if I was to go back in and do some nicer quiz scores for some of these people, because supposing they had studied, instead of just the random numbers, I did a random number between 0 and 1, so of course half of them were showing up below 50%. So let's go ahead and force a little more higher grades into here for some of these students. One more set of high grades maybe here. That pops the quizzes for Mr. Baggins into the passing rate. And now what? Mr. Baggins looks like he's doing pretty well. Let's give him a passing final as well. Let's see how that goes. Let's suppose he does a little bit better on the final. This is probably a terribly painful looking grade command. I will chat you through it. It goes ahead and it takes each of these pieces and it multiplies it by its weight. And then it divides those by the sum, and each sum piece has an if statement, because suppose that Mr. Baggins hadn't taken his final exam yet. Well, we want the weighted mean, so we don't want that to count. What if in fact no one has taken their exams yet? We don't want to have, even though exams plus final exam is half the class, we don't want to have a maximum possible score of 50%. We want their actual grade possible. So, now let me undo as many of those as I can. There we go. Now we're all back. This if is important. It sums up each of these pieces as long as, well, as long as we've got something that's non-zero there. I did a bit of a cheat. Notice how I did it. Let me take a look at this one here. Actually, I didn't do a cheat. Never mind. I did not do a cheat. Ignore me. I am not cheating. It takes a look and it sees whether a student has something for each of these pieces. So notice that it's important that I record a score. So take a look at Gandalf's scores. He has no final exam. He's done a lot of 80s. And he has no final exam. If you record a 0 here, that weighted average doesn't work because Mr. Gandalf has just failed his final exam. And so the one downside to the way I've done this, I'm sure there's probably a workaround, I'm just not thinking here at 10 o'clock at night on how to fix this, and probably I just hadn't built it in there yet. But notice maybe if I gave him a grade of 1%, you need something bigger than 0. In all honesty, what I do for my finals is students who show up and write their name, they do get 1% for their name. I would probably honestly give him 0.1% for having been enrolled in the class still. That's not going to obviously affect his letter grade at all, really. I mean, if you really cared, you could put many zeros and a 1 there. As long as it's not 0 itself, then the system will work and it will not create anything there for him. And so then you can see how people are doing. So again, let's put some good final exam scores here. These students worked hard and tried other than, I suppose, Grima, who I guess had dropped, so he truly does need a 0 there. Well, no, I guess he needs that 0.001, right? And then Azog did show up to his final exam. He did something there. All right. So we've got those grades. Let's go ahead and look at the overview. As you can see, as the grades update, the letter grades update, that makes the counts update, that makes this head count thing update. So I think the very last thing I should do is show you how I did that. We went to Insert, and then we wanted to create a chart. I wanted to have one of these column charts. I wanted it to look fancy, so I think I picked 3D is what I was going to do. And I think the way I did that was I actually just highlighted these things here, clicked on Chart and clicked on 3D, and it looks like it gave me that list of things. If I had put the W's somehow on top, which we could have done with some more clever cell organization, then maybe the W's could be to the left of the F's. If you want to make it look really fancy, you can select Chart Styles. You can do whatever you want to make things work. I like to do it with these basic numbers so that I have these sort of straight up head counts. There we go. So that is the so-called gradebook, easy peasy lemon squeezy gradebook. I did say easy peasy. I have talked to you for 52 minutes. Normally I would have edited this and made it seem a lot more natural, but it is also easy peasy, and I think that's fair to say because, in fact, you can go to my website, mattwiley.org, and download this template from the website, and with any luck that will be true by later tonight. And so you don't have to make as much. You can just go ahead and edit. Again, I suspect the biggest things you need to edit is getting more rooms in the assessments for those other assessments that you might be interested in, and probably making a lot more clicker sections. If you don't use clickers, that's fine. For example, my online class doesn't use clickers. I would just get rid of this, and attendance, besides going to the online attendance form, which I think just does it by the week, I would just hand code those in, and I would probably have to change this attendance rate calculation just a little bit. Notice though, if these students, I hadn't done the calculation in there, but provided this student had a 80% attendance, it didn't matter that they're failing, that drop will go away. So as long as you calculate the right attendance rate, which you can do either via clicker, I think, by talking about missed and number of days in the course so far. Again, the count if command I think is helpful there. You can also just sort of have a running calculation over here on the side that says how many absences are shown up. And if you know how many days there are in the class, then you can know how many absences there are, in which case maybe the attendance rate isn't so much a percent that you're talking about, but maybe this drop command is looking for if the number of absences gets over 5, 10, 20, depending on what percent and how many you want to trigger your flag. Alright, I hope to see several of you on Tuesday, but if not, maybe you'll watch this video, and I really think the best thing, since this is insanely long, is to just download the gradebook and play with it, and fast forward through the video and ignore me as much as possible. Good luck on the start of term, everyone, and I hope to see you at, I don't know, 8 o'clock on tomorrow morning.